So you now have a feel for what functional decomposition is. It's taking the big level and breaking it up into different steps. The steps should be kind of an achievable step, something that makes sense. Like, don't go from having dinner down to print lines right there. That's too big of a gap. You need something that is basically equal weight, and we'll talk about that more as we go. We'll get into that a little bit more. So let's talk about how we define the data flow. How do we write it down? So the idea behind this is we have these interdependent functionalities here. We want to have each of them performing a unique operation, but they need to work together. So when I'm procuring food, I'm cooking food, I'm having food, there's a relationship between those. I'm obviously going to need to cook the food that I just bought. I'm going to eat the food that I just cooked. And so we need to define those interactions between the processes to really get down to what I really have going on. It's an integral part of the model is saying, what are the inputs, what are the outputs? And we didn't forget about it necessarily. We just need to come back to that as part of our data flow diagram. So when we define a data flow, remember we talked about that context diagram. We have processes inside of there. And we need inputs and outputs then for each of the flow to happen. Data doesn't just trickle. It doesn't just drop. It doesn't just appear. It flows. So a process here defines a transformation of data. I have some input, which is when I say having dinner, well, what do we want for dinner? Pasta or sushi or whatever your favorite would be inside of there. That's what kicks it off. And then the output is, I got nutrition at the end. It was yummy. I'm ready to go have energy for the next day. And so the arrow must represent an input from somewhere to somewhere. An output from somewhere to somewhere on the other side of it. So there has to be interconnections. Now, you can have some of them at the ends that are just coming from, quote, nowhere, because that's the caller to this process. That's the user selecting something. That's when I go to a website and hit submit on my order. That's where they come along and cook the food and deliver the food and bring it back to me, for instance. So the process then has to be a valid process within there. So in the example we saw before, having dinner, I have my shopping list that I take to the grocery store. From the grocery store, I have the unprepared food, which I take to the kitchen. From the kitchen, I take that unprepared food and I prepare it into prepared food. And then I put that in my mouth and walk away with nutrition and something else that comes with it later on, normally about 8 hours later. But we'll forget about that for now. The important thing is we have an arrow from somewhere to somewhere. And so the goal was to get nutrition, and we do that by ordering something specific for dinner. Now, as cool as this picture is, it's informal. Sometimes that's cool, sometimes it's fun, but really we want to talk about the formal documentation because that formal documentation means something. As much as this picture means something interesting and fun here, it doesn't necessarily mean something in software. So I want to use the bubbles appropriately. That's if you're drawing these things, you need to use the bubbles appropriately. And so just a circle. You can do this inside of, and this was all built inside of PowerPoint. You don't need any fancy tools inside of this. You can use fancy tools, but you can do it very easily in any sort of the Microsoft Office drawing tools as well. And so structured analysis allows us to use the circles or the bubbles to represent the process or the transformation of the module or whatever word you want to use for it. Typically, it's going to be a procedure or function inside of a procedural programming language. And so again, we have the shopping list coming in, and we go shopping. We have unprepared food coming out. Take it to cook the food. Now notice here we have the underscore inside of there. It makes it look a little bit more codish instead of having spaces inside of there. But there's the flow of where it's coming from and where it's going to. The module then connects each of these things. We have the inputs coming in from the shopping list. We have the outputs coming out of nutrition. If you looked at the context diagram, you'll see, hopefully, the input and the outputs that are associated with that. So it shouldn't be stuff that comes out of nowhere. Now, if you look at this, there's actually some faults in this. The point of writing this stuff down is to have a better understanding of the processes. So if you look at this really carefully and you think about it, is a shopping list the only input I need to go shopping? Is unprepared food the only thing I need to cook food? There's other elements that are missing inside of here, and there's other elements that have to be considered. Now, that's part of the design flow. As we'll see later on, we'll get to some of this later on as we go into other videos, but we have mechanisms that can go through and double check this. Now, even just at the top level, you can say, well, hey, when you go to the grocery store, do you just bring your shopping list or do you also bring a form of payment? I guess you probably do. Most shopping places require some form of payment, some sort of accountability inside of there. So you bring cash, you bring your credit card, you bring some way of paying for this stuff. And so you could say immediately like, hey, I'm missing an input, or I'm missing something that needs to be part of my system. So I don't necessarily want every internal order to come off of, I have to have a payment that's passed along. I could say, hey, for my company, when we go shopping, we already have an account for this. So maybe something that's behind the scenes is the payment mechanism that's internally. And there'll be other mechanisms we'll learn about later on that keeps track of that. But it's something that should be showing up at this early level of the documentation, that I should be able to see where these things are coming from. And that's where we get furthermore into the breakdown. So as we break down the module further, we go talk about go shopping. You can see the shopping list by itself is not necessarily enough. I might see when I say go through and select groceries and I go to pay the cashier as I've broken it down, I need to not just show them the groceries I picked, I need the groceries and money. Where did that money come from? Well, I might not have saw that at the first level, but by breaking it down further, that's where I might see that. So groceries and money comes out of the selecting groceries process. I've never walked around a grocery store picking stuff off the aisles and had money magically show up to pay for it. That's where the balancing comes in. So I give the groceries to the cashier and money, and they give me back the groceries. Okay, so that's the idea of this flow. I start to find things either at a high level conceptually or at a lower level when I break it down. So maybe I saw it back here and said, hey, when I go shopping, I need to take more than one thing with me. But maybe not. Maybe I needed to break it down to here and say, okay, when I go pay a cashier, I give them the groceries. Oh, yeah, I have to give them cash of some kind. Both of these are very good ways of being able to detect that. So that's the process. That's a formal documentation that should be capturing inside of your assignments if you're going to build data flow diagrams. This is what this is, a flow of data, a DFD, a data flow diagram. We'll talk a little bit about how we finish these up here next, but take a moment maybe in the meantime and draw up a data flow diagram.